I'll take her." The words left Caleb Morgan's mouth before his mind could stop them. The entire crowd turned. Clara Whitmore stood frozen on that platform, her scarred hands gripping each other so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She was simply enduring the way a woman does when she has her whole life learning that dignity is the only thing no one can auction away. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning had started like every other morning in Red Creek, Wyoming, ordinary, unremarkable, and entirely unaware that by noon it would produce a moment nobody in town would forget for the rest of their lives. Caleb Morgan had not come to town for a wife. He had made that decision 5 years ago, standing at a grave on a hillside while the November wind tried to knock him sideways. He had made it again every morning since, climbing out of bed alone, eating alone, riding out alone, and returning to a house that had stopped feeling like a home somewhere around the second winter. He had made it so many times, in fact, that it had stopped feeling like a decision at all. It had simply become the shape of his life. He came to town for flour, salt, wire fencing, and if Haggerty's store still had any left, a new pair of work gloves. That was the full extent of his ambitions for the day. The bride auction was already underway when he tied his horse at the post outside Haggerty's. He could hear the auctioneer's voice carrying down the main street, that practiced boom of a man who had learned to even the mundane sound significant. Caleb ignored it. He had ignored the last 3 bride auctions and saw no reason to treat this one differently. He bought his flour. He bought his salt. He was examining a coil of wire fencing when Samuel Briggs, who ran the feed store next door and had never in his life managed to mind his own business, leaned over and said, "They've got a strange one up there today, Morgan." "Woman, nobody's moving on, been standing up there, going on 20 minutes. Caleb didn't look up from the wire. "Not my concern." "No," Samuel agreed. "Suppose not." There was a pause. "Just saying. Even Victor Hale passed. And Victor Hale once paid $40 for a mule he didn't need, just because nobody else bid on it." Caleb set down the wire, not because Samuel's words had moved him, but because something in the quality of the silence drifting down from the auction platform had changed. It was the kind of silence that has weight to it, the kind that settles over a crowd, not when something boring is happening, but when something that should bother people is happening. And nobody wants to be the first to admit it bothers them. He told himself he was only walking that direction, because Haggerty's was sold out of gloves, and there was a dry goods store on the other side of the platform. He told himself that for about 30 feet. Then he saw her. Clara Whitmore was not what most men in Red Creek would have called a striking woman. She was not tall. She was not dressed in anything that caught the eye. Her hair was the color of autumn before the color fully arrives, a brown that hadn't quite decided what it wanted to be, pulled back with the kind of practical efficiency that said she had more important things to think about than elaborate arrangements. She was 27 years old, and she looked every year of it, not in the way of a woman who had let herself go, but in the way of a woman who had worked hard and felt things deeply and hadn't had the luxury of pretending otherwise. What caught Caleb's attention was not any of that. It was her hands. They were folded in front of her at the level of her waist, and she was holding them together so tightly that the knuckles had gone pale. Along the back of her left hand and up toward her wrist, he could see the edge of a burn scar, old, well-healed, but visible enough that 2 men standing to Caleb's left were commenting on it in voices. They weren't bothering to lower. And Clara Whitmore was standing absolutely still, her chin level, her eyes fixed on some middle distance that wasn't quite any of the faces watching her, and she was not flinching. That was the part that stopped him cold. Most people, standing on a platform being discussed like livestock, would have done something to manage the moment. Looked at their feet, let tears show, tried to smile in a way that invited sympathy. Clara Whitmore was doing none of those things. She was simply enduring it with a composure so complete it looked almost like armor. And Caleb, who had spent 5 years building his own armor and knew exactly what it cost to maintain it, recognized what he was looking at. Clara Whitmore, the auctioneer was saying, consulting his paper with the mild tone of a man reading a grocery list. 27 years of age, no family connections in the territory. No dowry, no property, previously employed as domestic help in Cheyenne. Currently, what happened to her hand? A man in the crowd called out. The auctioneer paused. Fire, some years back. No lasting impairment to her working ability, I'm told. What about her working ability to be worth looking at? Someone else said, and several men laughed. Clara's folded hands tightened. That was the only thing that moved. Caleb had been called a cold man. He had been called hard. He had been called the lone wolf of the valley by people who thought they were being poetic and were actually just describing what they saw accurately enough. He had not felt uncomplicated righteous anger in a long time. He had thought that particular capacity had died somewhere, alongside everything else, in the autumn of 1879. It had not died. It had simply been waiting for something worth feeling it about. Clara Whitmore, the auctioneer, continued, with the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned not to make eye contact with the merchandise. We'll open at $15, called a heavyset man near the front. Not because he wanted her, Caleb understood immediately. Because he was the kind of man who bids on things he doesn't want, simply to demonstrate that he can. $15, the auctioneer acknowledged. Do I hear 20? Silence, not the polite silence of a crowd considering. The deliberate silence of a crowd that had already decided and was now simply waiting for the formality to conclude. A few men were already turning away. A woman near the general store said something to her companion, and they both laughed quietly. Victor Hale, who was standing at the edge of the crowd in a coat that cost more than most men in Red Creek made in 2 months, had his arms crossed and his expression arranged in the particular configuration of a man who finds something faintly amusing, but beneath genuine attention. $20? The auctioneer tried again. Clara Whitmore looked at the middle distance. Her hands were shaking now, very slightly, barely visible. The kind of trembling that happens when a person has been holding something rigid for so long that the muscles begin to betray them, regardless of how much the mind insists otherwise. Caleb opened his mouth. He had not planned to. He had made no decision. There was no rational thought involved in what happened next, only the sudden absolute clarity of a man who has watched something wrong continue for precisely as long as he can stomach it. I'll take her. The silence that followed was of a completely different quality than the one before. It was the silence of 30 people simultaneously forgetting what they were about to say. The auctioneer blinked. I beg your pardon? I said I'll take her. Caleb had not raised his voice. He didn't need to. 5 years of living alone had stripped away any habit of speaking to be heard over other people. And what remained was a voice that simply said what it meant and waited for the world to catch up. Whatever the bid is, I'll take her. He watched Clara Whitmore finally look directly at something. That something was him. Her expression was not relief. It was not gratitude. It was something much more complicated and much more honest, the expression of a woman who has been surprised in a way she doesn't yet have a category for. Victor Hale uncrossed his arms. Morgan. His voice had that particular quality of a man accustomed to speaking and having people orient toward him like plants toward light. You can't be serious. Caleb looked at him. Did I sound like I was joking? You sound like a man who's been alone too long and is making a decision he'll regret before the week is out. Victor, I've made decisions I regret before. Usually the ones where I let other people talk me out of what I already knew was right. He turned back to the auctioneer. $15, your opening bid. Is there any other bidder? The crowd was very quiet. Going once, the auctioneer said, with the air of a man who is not entirely sure what he is witnessing, but has been paid to conduct the process regardless of its unusual developments. Going twice, silence, sold to Caleb Morgan. Caleb walked toward the platform. He was aware of the crowd's attention, the way you're aware of wind present, pushing, something to move through rather than stop for. He climbed the 2 steps to the platform and stopped in front of Clara Whitmore. Up close, she was even stiller than she'd appeared from a distance. The composure he had noticed from 30 feet away was, he realized, something she had been maintaining at considerable personal cost. Her eyes were dark brown and very direct, and there was absolutely nothing soft or yielding in them, which was the first thing that made him think she might actually survive what came next. "My name is Caleb Morgan," he said. "I have a ranch about 8 miles northeast. It's in fair condition. I'm not much for company, but I'm not cruel, and I'll tell you honestly what I expect and what I can offer. After that, what you decide to do is your business." Clara looked at him for a moment that stretched long enough for him to notice she was taking his measure with an efficiency that suggested she had been evaluating men's intentions her entire life and had gotten very good at it. "What do you expect?" she said. Her voice was quieter than he'd anticipated. Not soft quiet. Like a person who had learned to conserve energy for things that mattered. "Work," he said. "The ranch has been running short-handed. I expect a woman who can hold up her end of things. Cook, clean, tend the kitchen garden, help with the smaller stock when needed. I don't expect anything." He paused, choosing words with more care than he usually bothered with. "I don't expect anything that isn't agreed to freely." Something shifted in her expression. It was subtle enough that he might have missed it, if he hadn't been watching carefully. A slight relaxation around her eyes, not relief exactly. More like the recalibration of someone who had been braced for one thing and encountered another. "What can you offer?" she asked. "A room of your own. 3 meals. Wages if you want them, or savings held for you if that's more useful. Safety." He said that last word carefully, because he meant it precisely, and he wanted her to understand that he meant it precisely. "Nobody on my land will treat you the way this crowd just did. I can promise you that." Clara Whitmore was quiet for 5 full seconds. Caleb counted them. "All right," she said, "that was all." Not thank you, not relief spilling over into words. Just a direct acceptance from a woman who had been through enough that she had learned to separate what was real from what was performance, and had no interest in the latter. They walked off the platform together, not touching, not speaking, while the crowd parted around them and then closed behind them the way water closes after a stone. Victor Hale's voice followed them. "You'll regret this, Morgan." "Mark me." Caleb didn't look back, already noted Victor. "Thank you for the input." The ride out to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours. Clara sat behind him. On the horse he hadn't brought the wagon, a fact he now recognized as a significant oversight, with her single bag tied to the saddle. She didn't make unnecessary conversation. She didn't fill the silence with nervous chatter. She held herself with the careful balance of a woman who was accustomed to being in proximity to people who had not necessarily proven themselves trustworthy yet. And Caleb found he appreciated the honesty of that more than any amount of gracious small talk would have provided. "About halfway through the ride," she said, "the scar. You didn't ask about it. Didn't figure it was my business unless you made it my business." A pause. "Most people ask immediately. Most people," Caleb said, "are curious about things that aren't their concern. I've got enough things that are my concern without adding to the list." She was quiet for a while after that. Then it was a fire. "When I was 19, the family I worked for, their barn caught. I went in for the children." She said it the way you say something you have said many times before, with the flat tone of a story that has been reduced to its most essential facts through repetition. "The children got out. I got this." A pause. "People seem to think that changes something about what I'm worth. I've never been able to work out exactly what." Caleb said nothing for a moment. The horse's hooves made their steady rhythm against the packed earth of the road. "People," he said finally, "decide things about other people and then spend the rest of their lives finding evidence to support what they decided. It's got nothing to do with the person they're deciding about. Clara said nothing, but he felt, very slightly, the tension in her posture change. When they arrived at the ranch, Caleb watched her take it in. He watched her see the fences that needed repair, the kitchen garden that had gone to seed in 2 seasons of neglect, the porch boards that had warped from 3 winters of rain, getting under them. He watched her see all of that and say nothing about it. Then she said the garden can be recovered. The soil looks good. That was when Caleb understood that whatever else Clara Whitmore was, she was not a woman who wasted time on what couldn't be changed. He showed her the house. He showed her the room that would be hers. A back bedroom that had been used for storage, which he had cleared out 2 weeks ago when his father had mentioned the auctions were coming, and Caleb had said, firmly and without room for discussion, that he was not interested, and his father had said nothing, but had given him the particular look that fathers who know their children very well deploy in moments like that. The room was plain, clean. There was a bed, a washstand, a small window facing east. Clara set her bag down and looked around. "It's fine," she said. "It's not much," Caleb said. "It has a door that closes." She looked at him directly. "That's more than I've had in 3 years." He left her to settle in and went back out to the work that never stopped waiting. Because work was the one thing in his life that had remained constant and reliable, and entirely free of the complications that people brought with them. He worked until the light failed, and when he came back to the house, there was a lamp lit in the kitchen and a smell coming from the stove that stopped him at the door. He hadn't smelled a meal cooking in this kitchen in 5 years. He stood there for a moment longer than he needed to. Clara was at the stove with her back to him, stirring something in a pot with the focused economy of a woman who has cooked in enough different kitchens to do it efficiently anywhere. She had found whatever was in his pantry, which he knew objectively was not much, and done something with it that smelled like an actual meal rather than the functional sustenance he had been preparing for himself since long. Enough ago that he had stopped noticing the difference. "You didn't have to," he started. "I cook," she said, without turning around. "It's what I do. Sit down." He sat down. It was the first time in longer than he could immediately calculate that someone had told him to sit down at his own table, and he had done it without argument. The meal was simple salt pork, beans, cornbread she had somehow produced in the time he'd been outside, and a pot of coffee that was considerably stronger than the watery approximation he usually made for himself. It was not extraordinary food. It was the kind of food made by a person who understood that adequate, consistent, and reliable is worth more than occasional brilliance. They ate in silence, not uncomfortable silence, something else. The silence of 2 people who have not yet established the vocabulary of each other's company, and are being careful about it. Like the first night in a new territory, when you make your camp and tend your fire, and stay alert without being afraid. After a while, Clara said, "Your father's name is Samuel. He was at the auction." Caleb looked up. "He watched the whole thing," she said. "He didn't bid, but he watched, and, when you spoke, she paused, and something that might have been the beginning of a small smile moved at the corner of her mouth before it decided not to arrive. He nodded, like he'd been waiting for it. Caleb set down his fork. "My father," he said slowly, "has approximately 17 different opinions about how I should be living my life, and approximately no awareness of when those opinions have not been requested. He loves you." "Yes," Caleb said, "he does." "Which he believes entitles him to an unlimited number of observations about my choices." Clara looked at him steadily. "That's not the worst problem to have." He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "No," he said finally, "I suppose it isn't." The next morning, Caleb rose before dawn, as he always did, and went out to begin the day's work. When he came back to the house at mid-morning for the water jug he'd forgotten, Clara was in the kitchen garden. She had been there for at least 2 hours, by the look of the work already done. She had cleared the weeds from the near quarter of the plot, turned the soil at the edge of the herb section, and found he had no idea how the old iron markers his wife had used to label the rows, which he had been certain were lost years ago. She was on her knees in the dirt, working with her bare hands, the left one, with its scarred back, moving exactly as easily and efficiently as the right. Her hair had come loose on one side. Her dress was already dirty at the knees and elbows. She looked up when he stopped. "The rosemary survived," she said. "It's overgrown, but it's alive. I'm going to cut it back and let it recover. The rest of the herbs, I think there's thyme in there somewhere. It's hard to tell yet." Caleb looked at the garden that he had not looked at, genuinely looked at, in years. "My wife planted those," he said. The words came out before he'd thought about whether to say them. They had a sound he wasn't used to, present tense, not past, which was wrong, but somehow the garden made it wrong, in a way that didn't cut the way it usually did. Clara sat back on her heels. "I know," she said quietly. "I can tell." "How?" "Because whoever planted it knew what they were doing. The layout, the spacing, it's thoughtful." She understood plants. She looked back at the ground. "I'll take care of it. I won't change anything she planned. Only bring it back to what it was supposed to be." Caleb stood there. He had no idea what to say to that. He picked up his water jug and went back to work. By the end of the first week, a pattern had established itself without either of them designing it. Caleb rose early and worked the land and the cattle. Clara maintained the house and garden, and quietly began addressing the dozen small repairs that had accumulated in years of a man living alone with priorities elsewhere. The warped porch board, the kitchen window that hadn't shut properly since the summer before last, the hinge on the barn door that complained loudly every time it moved, which Caleb had been ignoring for so long that he had stopped hearing it. On the seventh evening, he came in to find her at the kitchen table, with a needle and thread, mending the hem of her second dress she had, as far as he could tell, exactly two, with the small concentrated focus of a woman making the most of what she had. He stood in the doorway. "You need more clothes," he said. She looked up. "These are fine." "They're not fine. You've been wearing the same two things all week." "Mr. Morgan." Caleb. A brief pause. "I manage with what I have." "I don't need. I'll be going into town on Saturday," he said. "You'll come with me, and we'll get what you need. It's not charity. You're working hard enough that you're entitled to proper clothes to work in. That's practical, not." He stopped, because he could see from her expression that this conversation was touching something complicated. "It's not a gift. Consider it part of the arrangement." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. Saturday came, and they drove into Red Creek together in the wagon. The town noticed. The town always noticed things, and two people who had left together a week ago, as a strange and unexpected pairing arriving together in a wagon as something that looked, from the outside, like a functional household. That was the kind of thing Red Creek paid attention to. Martha Hale, who was Victor's wife, and whose social antennae were calibrated to an almost supernatural sensitivity, watched them from outside the millinery shop with an expression Caleb recognized as the early stages of a story being constructed. He ignored her. At the dry goods store, Clara moved with the efficiency of a woman who had spent her life buying as little as possible and making it last as long as possible. She chose fabric for two practical work dresses and a heavier one for cold weather. She chose thread, a replacement needle, a pair of work gloves. She did not look at anything else. The proprietress, a woman named Helen Garrett, who had lived in Red Creek for 30 years and had opinions about everything, watched Clara's selections with an expression that shifted from the cautious neutrality she'd probably prepared in advance to something more like genuine assessment. "You know what you're doing," Helen said, not unkindly. "I try to," Clara said. "That man of yours," Helen said, and then seemed to think better of how she'd started that sentence. "He hasn't bought anything for the house in years." "Not since." "I know," Clara said quietly. Helen looked at her carefully. "Do you?" "Some of it," Clara said. "Enough." When they came out of the store, Caleb was waiting at the wagon. He looked at the bundle she was carrying, small, practical. nothing excessive, and something in his expression shifted through a configuration he would not have been able to name. "That all you need?" he asked. "For now." They drove home through the late afternoon, and at some point Clara fell asleep against the side of the wagon with the exhaustion of a woman who had been running on vigilance and had finally, in a small and tentative way, begun to let it rest. Caleb drove and said nothing, but he was aware, in the particular way that a man who has been very alone for a very long time becomes aware of presence, that the seat beside him was no longer empty. 3 weeks in, his father came. Samuel Morgan arrived on a Tuesday morning with a saddlebag full of reasons why he just happened to be passing by, none of which fooled anyone. He was 62 years old and still sat a horse, like a man 20 years younger. And he had the kind of face that showed every year of a life lived outdoors, and the kind of eyes that showed a man who paid attention to people. Clara offered him coffee. He accepted it. He sat at the kitchen table and talked about the price of feed and the weather coming in from the northwest and the Ferguson boy getting married, and all the while he was watching Clara move around the kitchen with the focused peripheral attention of a man who came here specifically to watch Clara move around the kitchen. When she went out to the garden to check the watering, Samuel looked at Caleb. "She's something," he said. "She works hard," Caleb said. "That's not what I said." Caleb refilled his own coffee. "I know what you said. She's good for this place." "Already. I can see it, Dad. I'm not saying anything you don't already know." "You're saying approximately 17 things I know, in addition to implications I could do without." Samuel wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at his son with the expression of a man choosing his next words more carefully than usual. "I'm going to say one thing," he said, "and then I'll let it alone." Caleb looked at him. "One thing, she's carrying something heavy. Same as you, and she's not putting it down any faster than you are. But I want you to notice," he paused, "she's not using it as a wall. She's not keeping people out with it. And that took something. Something I'm not sure you understand yet, because you've been using yours as a wall for 5 years." Caleb said nothing. Samuel finished his coffee and stood up. "Good coffee," he said. "You teach her to make it that strong, or she came that way." "She came that way. Good." He picked up his hat. "Good." That night, after his father had ridden back toward town, Caleb sat on the porch in the cooling dark. The lamp was lit inside. Through the window, he could hear the small sounds of Clara doing the last things before bed. The sound of the kettle being moved, the sound of a chair being pushed back, the sound of a house being inhabited. He had forgotten what that sounded like. He sat with it for a long time. Inside, Clara paused at the window and looked at him just for a moment, just a glance, from someone who had spent a long time watching people, because watching was how you learned things that speaking didn't tell you. What she saw was a man sitting with something heavy in both hands, in the particular posture of someone who is beginning to wonder, for the first time in a long time, whether it might be possible to set it down. She didn't say anything. She went to bed, but she lay there in the dark for a while, with her eyes open, thinking about the way he had said, without inflection, that his wife had planted the garden, and the way the words had looked coming out of him, and the fact that a man who claimed he wanted to be alone had driven into town and bought her clothes without being asked. She was not a woman given to fast conclusions. She had learned that fast conclusions were usually just hopes dressed up as certainty, and hope had cost her enough over the years that she had gotten careful with it. But she was also, underneath everything that had made her careful, a woman who had not stopped hoping entirely. That felt, in the dark of a room with a door that closed, like something worth holding on to. 1 month in, Victor Hale rode up to the ranch. He came alone, which was unusual. Victor traveled with the comfortable entourage of a man who has learned that other people's presence amplifies his own significance. Seeing him arrive alone, Caleb felt the particular alertness of a man who knows from experience that when Victor Hale does something out of his usual pattern, there is a reason for it. Caleb was at the fence line. He didn't move toward the approaching rider. He let Victor come to him. Victor reined in, took in the state of the ranch with a slow survey designed to communicate that he was taking in the state of the ranch, and then looked at Caleb with an expression of carefully calibrated concern. "Just checking in on a neighbor," he said. "Victor," Caleb said. "It's a 4-mile ride. You don't make 4-mile rides to check in on neighbors." Victor smiled. It was a handsome smile, technically. It had all the right qualities. "How's the woman settling in?" "She has a name, Clara. How's Clara settling in?" "Fine. People in town are talking, you know." "People in town," Caleb said, "talk about everything. It's their primary occupation, they're saying." Victor paused with theatrical consideration, as though he were reluctant to be the messenger of something unpleasant. "They're saying you took her out of pity, that you felt sorry for her, standing up there, and acted without thinking. That a man like you, Victor, wouldn't genuinely want." "Victor," he stopped. "What people in town say about my choices," Caleb said, "is not something I've lost sleep over since approximately 1881. I'm not planning to start now." He turned back to the fence. "Safe ride home." Victor was quiet for a moment. "She'll leave," he said then. Differently. The performance gone out of it, replaced by something flatter and somehow more deliberate. When she understands what she's gotten into, a man who closed himself off years ago, a ranch that's half run down, a life with no... "Goodbye, Victor." Victor looked at him a moment longer. Then he turned his horse and rode back the way he came. Caleb watched him go. Then he drove the fence post he'd been about to drive before the interruption, with more force than was strictly necessary. When he came in for the noon meal, Clara set his plate in front of him and said, without preamble, "Victor Hale was here." Yes, what did he want? Caleb looked at her. To be unpleasant. It's a hobby of his. She sat down across from him with her own plate. "What did he say?" A pause. "He said people think I brought you here out of pity." Clara's hands were very still on the table. "Did you?" she asked. Her voice was entirely neutral. It was the neutrality of a woman who has asked a question she genuinely needs answered and has made the decision to receive the answer as it comes, regardless of what it is. Caleb looked at his food, then at her. "No," he said. "I don't know exactly why I said what I said at that auction. But it wasn't pity. Pity is what you feel for someone who's helpless. You weren't helpless, you were just..." He stopped. Found the word. Outnumbered. Clara looked at him. Something moved in her expression that she didn't entirely succeed in keeping from her face, a brief, involuntary softening, there and then managed back down before it fully arrived. "All right," she said. They ate. Outside, the ranch went on doing what ranches do, requiring attention, requiring work, requiring the presence of people who have decided, for whatever collection of reasons life has handed them, to be there. Inside, two people who had both decided, separately and without consultation, that being present was the most they could reasonably promise, sat at a table together and ate a meal. It was not a love story yet, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, Clara had lived long enough to know, were not small things. They were the place where everything else started from. The second month was when things began to shift in ways that neither of them had named and both of them had noticed. It started with small things. It always starts with small things. A man who had eaten his meals standing at the counter for 5 years now sat at the table every evening. A woman who had spent 3 years sleeping lightly, one ear always open for footsteps in the hall, now slept until the birds started. Neither of them commented on these changes. They simply occurred, the way water finds its level, not because anyone directed it, but because it was the natural consequence of conditions allowing it. Caleb noticed other things too. He noticed that Clara had begun waking before him, which he would not have thought possible, given that he rose before 5. He noticed because one morning he came down before dawn to find the stove already lit and coffee already made, and Clara, sitting at the kitchen table, with a scrap of paper, making a list of something in small, careful handwriting. She looked up when he came in. Neither of them said anything about the fact that she had been up before him. She poured him coffee. He sat down. They drank it in the half-dark before the day required them to begin it. He found he looked forward to those mornings. That was the first thing he admitted to himself. Not aloud, not to anyone, just inside the privacy of his own skull, where admissions were permitted to exist without consequence. The second thing he admitted was harder. He had started paying attention to when she was in the room. Not watching her, not in any way that was uncomfortable or strange. Simply aware. The way you become aware of the fire in the hearth when you've been cold long enough. Not because it demands your attention, but because warmth, once present, is impossible to be fully indifferent to. Clara, for her part, was navigating her own complicated territory. She had been careful, so carefully careful, not to want anything from this arrangement that wasn't explicitly included in its terms. A room, safety, work. Those were the words of the original agreement, and she had spent a month policing pieces, her own expectations with the discipline of a woman who had learned that wanting more than what was offered was the fastest road to a specific kind of grief. But Caleb Morgan kept doing things that were not in the original agreement. He fixed the chair in her room that wobbled, without being asked. He brought back a bolt of better quality fabric from a supply run, set it on the kitchen table, and said only, Helen Garrett said, this would wear better, and then went back outside before she could figure out how to respond. He started leaving his finished coffee cup on the counter instead of the table because he had noticed, without mentioning he'd noticed, that the table cup left a ring on the wood that she then had to clean. These were small things. Clara told herself repeatedly that they were small things. She told herself this with the focused intensity of a woman who knows that small things are exactly how the large ones begin. It was on a Wednesday evening, 6 weeks in, that the first real rupture happened. Caleb came in late from the south pasture, too late, well past dark, and when he sat down at the table, Clara set his plate in front of him, and he looked at it for a long moment without picking up his fork. The south fence is down, he said. How much of it? Enough. He picked up his fork, set it down again. Lost 4 cattle, maybe 5. Tracks go east toward Hale's land. Clara sat down across from him. Can you get them back? If they're on Hale's land, I'd need to go through him. His jaw was very tight. Which is not a conversation I'm eager to have. Because of what he said. It wasn't a question. Caleb looked at her. She looked back. They had developed in 6 weeks a vocabulary of direct glances that said things neither of them was quite ready to say in full sentences. Among other reasons, he said. What other reasons? A pause. Long enough that she thought he might not answer. Victor Hale was interested in this ranch, Caleb said finally, in the flat tone of someone reporting facts, stripped of everything except their outline. 2 years ago, he made an offer. I turned it down. He's made it clear since then that he considers that a temporary situation rather than a permanent one. Clara absorbed this, so he's not just a man with opinions about me. He's a man with interest in what you have. He's a man who believes things have a natural order. That land should accumulate toward people who already have it. Caleb finally picked up his fork and ate something, not because he was hungry, but because he had learned that the body needs to be maintained regardless of what the mind is doing. He doesn't think much of people who don't fit that order. Women with scars and no dowry, men who won't sell. Clara was quiet for a moment. The cattle, she said. Go get them. He looked at her. Don't let him have them, she said. Her voice was quiet, but there was something underneath the quietness that was not soft at all. Don't give him the satisfaction of thinking a downed fence is enough to take something from you. Ride out there tomorrow and tell him you're collecting what's yours, and if he argues, remind him that a man's cattle on another man's land is theft, and you know the sheriff well enough to say so. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. You don't know Hale, he said. No, she said, but I know men like him. I have my whole life. They count on people deciding the fight isn't worth it. The moment you decide it is, they recalculate. She met his gaze directly. Go get your cattle, Caleb, he went. The next morning, he rode out to the Hale ranch before 8 o'clock and came back before noon, With 4 cattle, one had indeed gone somewhere other than Hale's land, and would be found 3 days later in a ravine. Alive but thin, and the contained expression of a man who has had a conversation he did not enjoy and handled it well regardless. He didn't tell Clara the details of what was said. But he came in for the noon meal and sat at it down and said, "You were right," with the directness of a man who is not accustomed to saying those words and has decided to say them anyway. Clara put his food in front of him and said, "I know." He almost smiled. It was very nearly a smile. She turned back to the stove before she could examine her own expression too carefully. The 4th Saturday of the month, Samuel Morgan came again. He came ostensibly with a piece of farming equipment he'd said he was lending Caleb, which was accurate in that the equipment existed and was lent, but was not the primary reason for the visit, which everyone, including the equipment, understood. He arrived in time for the noon meal and stayed until late afternoon, and during those hours Clara watched something happen that she suspected was significant. Samuel talked to her, not the polite surface conversation of a man being careful around an uncertain quantity. He talked to her the way a person talks to someone they are genuinely interested in. He asked about her experience in Cheyenne, what work she had done, what she had liked about it. He asked about the garden, how she'd found the rosemary, whether she thought the west side would take beans or needed a different crop. He asked, with the directness of an old man who has decided life is too short for circling the point, whether she was all right. All right how? She asked. In general. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. This is a hard place to land. He's a hard man to live with. I say that with more love than criticism, but I say it truthfully. Clara looked at him carefully. He's not hard to live with, she said. He's careful. There's a difference. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said slowly. There is. He keeps his word, she said. He's fair. He's honest about what he thinks, which is more than most people manage. She paused. He's lonely in a way he doesn't know how to name, but he's not unkind. And the loneliness is, she stopped. Is what? Samuel asked quietly. Familiar, she said. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Samuel Morgan nodded, once slowly, with the expression of a man who has just heard something that confirms something he needed confirmed. After Samuel left, Caleb came in to find Clara washing the coffee cups in the basin, and there was something in the set of her shoulders that looked like a woman who had said more than she'd planned to and was now reviewing the consequences. He likes you, Caleb said. He loves you, she said, without turning around. He's watching out for you. That's what the visits are. I know what the visits are. She dried the cup, set it on the shelf. Did he tell you what he told me? Caleb asked. 2 years ago, when he first started suggesting I should consider, he stopped. Started again, when he first said I'd been alone long enough. Clara turned. No, what did he say? Caleb leaned against the doorframe. He was quiet long enough that she thought he'd decided not to answer. Then he said, your mother's absence doesn't mean the house should be empty. It means the house is waiting. Clara looked at him. The afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window at an angle, and Caleb was standing in the doorway with the particular stillness of a man who has said something that cost him something to say, and is now determining whether it was worth the cost. That's a wise thing, Clara said carefully. It made me furious when he said it. What does it make you now? A long pause. Less furious, he said. That was all. He went back outside. Clara stood at the kitchen sink for a moment longer than the task required. Less furious, she thought. With Caleb Morgan, she was beginning to understand that was a significant distance. The crisis came in the 7th week, and it came in the way that crises often do, through a door Clara had not thought to watch. A woman came to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon. She arrived in a good buggy, dressed well, and her name was Evelyn Marsh, and she was 34 years old and had been widowed 2 years prior. And she was the kind of woman that the town of Red Creek had probably assumed Caleb Morgan would eventually choose, if he chose anyone. She was handsome and composed, and she came from a family with land, and she moved through the world with the ease of someone who had never had to fight for the right to be taken seriously. Clara answered the door. She knew immediately, with the specific, uncomfortable intelligence of a woman who has spent her life reading rooms, quickly, what she was looking at. "Is Caleb Morgan at home?" Evelyn Marsh asked. Her voice was pleasant. She looked at Clara with the expression of someone making a rapid and not entirely favorable assessment. "He's out in the south pasture," Clara said. "I can take him a message." Evelyn looked at her again. "A beat too long. You're the woman from the auction," she said. Not cruelly, simply directly, with the particular candor of a woman who has decided that directness is more efficient than tact. "I'm Clara Morgan," Clara said. The name felt strange in her mouth. She had been calling herself that officially for 7 weeks, and had still not found the edges of it. "Yes," Evelyn absorbed this. "I see. Another beat." "Will you tell him Evelyn Marsh called? We're old acquaintances. I heard he was that there had been changes at the ranch." She smiled. "I wanted to see how he was getting on." "I'll tell him," Clara said. She told him. She told him that evening, matter-of-factly, the way she delivered information, flat and complete, without editorializing. "Evelyn Marsh came by. She says you're old acquaintances. She wanted to see how you were getting on." Caleb's expression did something she couldn't entirely read. "Did she?" "She said she heard there had been changes at the ranch." He was quiet. "That's all she said?" he asked. "That's all she said to me." There was a quality to those last 2 words, not accusatory, simply precise, that he heard correctly, because he looked at her. "She and I grew up in the same part of the valley. Her husband and I worked the same drives years back. Since he died, he stopped. There were conversations. After her husband passed. About whether it made sense, given both our situations, to consider." "You don't have to explain this to me," Clara said. "I'm explaining it because I think you should know it." She looked at him. He looked back. "We didn't arrive at anything," he said. "Because I wasn't." The pause was brief but complete. "I wasn't ready for anything. And then my father started talking about the auctions and I said no, and then somehow I said yes at the wrong moment, and here we are." Clara was very still. "Here we are," she said. "Yes. Do you wish it had gone differently? With her?" He was quiet for long enough that her heart did something uncomfortable. "No," he said. "I think I would have been a poor answer to what she needed. And I think she knew it better than I did." He looked at the table. "She deserves someone who can be fully present. I'm not sure I was capable of it." "Are you now?" Clara asked. She asked it carefully, the way you ask a question you've needed to ask for a while and have been waiting for the right conditions. He looked at her with the expression of a man who is genuinely considering the question, rather than deflecting it. "I think I'm more capable of it than I was 2 months ago," he said. Whether that's enough, I don't know yet. Honest, Clara thought. It's honest. She could work with honest. "All right," she said. She got up and began clearing the table. Because she was a woman who processed things in motion, and because there are moments in conversations where the wisest thing is to let what has been said settle before either person adds to it. Evelyn Marsh did not come back. Whatever she had come to assess, she had apparently assessed it. Clara heard through the general drift of information that passed through Red Creek and occasionally reached the Rinkench that Evelyn had received a letter from a cousin in Denver and was considering her options. That was the last she heard of it. But the visit had done something. It had put language around a question that had been living in the house without being spoken. And once something has been named, even indirectly, it becomes harder to pretend it isn't there. The 8th week brought a cold snap that arrived 3 weeks earlier than it should have, with the brisk indifference of Wyoming weather toward human planning. Caleb was up before dawn, dealing with the cattle, getting the younger animals under shelter before the temperature dropped further. Clara was up with him, because someone needed to keep the water from freezing in the inside containers, and someone needed to check on the chickens and manage the dozen small crises that cold weather generates as a matter of course. They worked side by side through most of that day, not always close, not always speaking, but coordinated in the way of two people who have spent enough time around each other to anticipate what the other will do next. At one point, Clara was struggling with the heavy barn door that had swollen in the cold and wouldn't move properly, and Caleb appeared beside her and hit it exactly once, with the flat of his hand, at the point where the hinge stuck, and it opened. "You have to hit it there," he said. "I'll remember," she said. They kept moving. At mid-afternoon, working at the side of the barn, Clara slipped on a patch of ice she hadn't seen. She didn't fall. She caught herself on the fence rail, but she wrenched her shoulder in doing so, and the sound she made was involuntary and sharp. Caleb was there in less than 3 seconds. He was beside her with his hand on her arm, before she'd finished catching her breath, and the speed of it, the immediacy of it, told her something she filed away carefully. "Where?" he said. "Shoulder. Just a wrench. I'm fine." "Let me see." "I'm fine, Caleb. Let me see." She stopped arguing, because the look on his face was not optional. He checked her arm with the focused practicality of a man who has dealt with injuries in isolated conditions and knows how to assess them, pressing carefully at the shoulder joint, watching her face for the location of the pain. "Nothing torn," he said, "but it'll be sore, I know." "I've had worse. I know you have." He said it quietly, without dramatics, and it was somehow worse than dramatics would have been. "Come inside. The chickens still need. I'll do the chickens." "Come inside." She came inside. She sat at the kitchen table, while he made coffee badly, nowhere near as good as hers, with the specific incompetence of a man who had gotten used to someone else doing it properly, and set it in front of her, and sat down across the table. "You're going to drink that," he said, looking at the cup, "and you're going to tell me if it's bad enough to need the doctor in town. It's not. Then you'll tell me what I can do in the meantime." Clara looked at him. This was not. She was clear-eyed enough to see it. This was not the action of a man who regarded her as a hired hand he didn't want to lose to injury. This was something else. Something that was visible in the speed with which he'd crossed the frozen ground when she made that sound. Something that was visible now in the way he was sitting, with his hands flat on the table, very still, in the posture of a man who is keeping himself from doing something he hasn't fully identified yet. "The coffee is bad," she said. "I know. You press too hard when you grind the beans." "Clara." "I'm all right," she said, more gently than she'd said anything to him in 8 weeks. "I promise you, I'm all right." He looked at her for a moment. "I know you are," he said. Then he stopped. The word he didn't say occupied the space between them with the particular weight of words that don't get said because they're too large for the moment and the speaker knows it. He picked up his own coffee cup. "I'll get the chickens," he said. He went out. Clara sat at the kitchen table and drank the badly made coffee and looked at the door he had gone through and thought about the speed of a man's boots crossing frozen ground toward the sound she'd made, and thought about the word he hadn't said. She thought about what it meant that the thought of that word didn't frighten her. That was the night, she admitted to herself quietly, privately. In the same interior space where Caleb was admitting things to himself that the agreement she had made 7 weeks ago was no longer adequate to describe what was happening in this house. The agreement had been room, meals, safety, work. That was what had been spoken. That was on the surface. Underneath the surface, something else was building. Carefully, quietly, without announcement or permission from either party. It was building the way things build, between two people who have both been hurt enough to be cautious, both been alone enough to be grateful, and both had enough good sense to know that what you've been given is something you don't take for granted. Clara finished the bad coffee. She got up, washed the cups, banked the stove for the night. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the lamp in the barn. Caleb dealing with the chickens she was supposed to have dealt with, and she thought about 8 weeks of small things accumulating into something she didn't have a name for yet. She thought about the fact that she didn't need a name for it yet. What she needed was to not waste it. When Caleb came back in, stamping cold from his boots, she was already at the bottom of the stairs. "The shoulder," he said. Take something for it, I will. There's liniment in the cabinet in the washroom, left side. Thank you, he nodded, turned toward the kitchen. Caleb. He turned back. She looked at him across the short distance of the hallway. This man who had said, I'll take her into a crowd that was waiting for a humiliation and had meant something by it that he probably hadn't understood himself at the time. And she said, You made very bad coffee. He looked at her. Yes, he said. Tomorrow I'll show you how to do it properly. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, he wasn't there yet. Not all the way, but the precursor to one. The possibility of one. The face of a man who has remembered, somewhere in the muscle memory of who he used to be, what smiling felt like. All right, he said. She went upstairs. He stood in the hallway for a moment in the dark house. Then he went to the kitchen, sat down at the table where they had eaten together every night for 8 weeks, and sat there in the quiet, with his hands around a cold cup, thinking about a woman who had slipped on ice and caught herself before she fell, and the sound she'd made in doing it, and the 8 seconds it had taken him to cross the ground between them. 8 seconds. He had been counting without knowing he was counting. That, he thought, in the honest dark of a house that had begun to feel like a home again, was probably something. He learned how to make the coffee properly the next morning. Clara stood beside him at the stove and talked him through it lighter on the grind. More patience with the heat. Don't rush the steep. And Caleb followed the instructions with the focused attention of a man who has decided that whatever task he has been given, he will do it correctly. He did not make jokes about it. He did not pretend it was beneath him. He simply listened and adjusted, and when the coffee was done, poured 2 cups and set hers in front of her before he took his own. Clara wrapped both hands around the cup and said, Better. Better than what I made last night. Better than I expected. He sat down across from her. Outside, the cold from the previous day had not broken entirely, and the light coming through the kitchen window was the thin, tentative light of a Wyoming morning that hasn't decided what it's going to be yet. Shoulder, he asked, manageable. You'll stay off the ice today. I'll be careful on the ice today, she said, with the mild but absolute firmness of a woman who does not accept being managed, but is willing to accept being worried about. He noted the distinction. He was getting better at noting those distinctions. There's a difference, she added. I heard the difference. Something settled between them, easy, almost familiar, and it was the easiness of it that Clara noticed most. 8 weeks ago, there had been nothing easy about any conversation in this house. Every exchange had been calibrated, measured, careful in the way of strangers, who are not yet sure of each other's limits. Now there was this. 2 people, at a kitchen table in the early morning, talking about coffee and ice, and the difference between being managed and being cared for. With the unself-conscious rhythm of people who have found their footing in each other's company. She noticed it. She did not say it. But she noticed it the way you notice a change in temperature, not dramatically, but certainly in your whole body at once. The shoulder kept her slower than usual for 2 days, which was 2 days more than she would have preferred. On the second afternoon, she was sitting at the kitchen table, resting under explicit protest, when Samuel Morgan arrived unannounced, which was his standard method of arrival, because he had long ago concluded that announcing himself gave people time to prepare versions of themselves. He wasn't interested in meeting. He took one look at her and said, What happened? Ice, she said. It's fine. Does it look fine to you? Caleb said from the doorway, appearing with the timing of a man who had been expecting exactly this question. It looks like a woman who was told to rest and is sitting at a table making lists, Samuel said, with the accuracy of a man who had raised a stubborn child and therefore recognized the behavior in its various forms. Clara looked down at her list. The spring planting order needs to be placed before January. If we don't get the seed order in by Clara, Samuel sat down. The seeds will wait. They won't, actually. Last year's late order meant. She does this, Caleb said to his father, with a quality in his voice that was not quite exasperated and was not quite fond, and was in fact precisely both, which was why Samuel heard it, and looked at his son quickly, and then looked away, just as quickly, wearing the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he suspected. "What does she do?" Samuel asked, keeping his face entirely neutral. "She's injured, and she makes lists instead of resting, because if she stops moving, she has to admit she's injured." Clara looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back. "That's very perceptive," she said, with the specific tone of a woman informing a man that he is correct, and she resents it slightly. Samuel picked up the seed list and looked at it. "I'll take this to Henderson's when I go back through town. He can put the order in." Clara opened her mouth. "Before you say it," Samuel said, "yes, I know you can do it yourself. But I'm going anyway, and Henderson trusts me, and it will save you a trip when you're mending." He put the list in his shirt pocket with the decisive air of someone who has ended a discussion. "Now, are you eating properly? You look thinner than when I was here last." "She eats fine," Caleb said. "She makes sure I eat and then eats herself, which means she usually eats less than she should because she gives away the better portions." There was a silence. Clara stared at him. The precision of what he'd just said, the fact that he had noticed not just that she ate, but how she ate, and the specific pattern of it. The way she consistently deflected the better portion of anything to him or to any guest without appearing to do so was unexpected enough that she had no immediate response prepared. "I do not," she said. "Last Tuesday," he said, "the pork. You gave me the larger piece and told me it was the same." "It was nearly the same, Clara. It was close." Samuel was looking at his coffee cup with the focused attention of a man who is determined not to smile and is winning the battle at considerable cost. "I'll make more pork," she said. "That's not the point," Caleb said. "Then, what is the point?" He looked at her with the directness he'd always had, that quality of saying what he meant without padding it, and said, "You've spent your whole life making sure other people have enough. I want to know who's been doing that for you." The kitchen went very quiet. Samuel picked up his coffee cup and drank from it with the careful deliberateness of a man removing himself from a moment that is not his. Clara held Caleb's gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she looked at the table. Then she looked back. "That's a long answer," she said quietly. "We have time," he said. She looked at him for another moment. "Nobody," she said, just the one word, flat and honest and final. Caleb nodded once, slowly. "All right." He got up, went to the stove, refilled her coffee cup more than his own, and sat back down. Clara looked at the cup. She did not say thank you. She understood he didn't want her to. She simply put her hands around it, and the gesture said what the words would have been inadequate for anyway. Samuel stayed for an hour and left with the seed list and the expression of a man who is very pleased about things he has decided not to mention. At the door he clasped Caleb's arm and said quietly, but not so quietly that Clara, who was a woman with good hearing, and no intention of missing this, couldn't hear it. "She's good, son." Caleb said, "I know," 3 words. But the way he said them, without hesitation, without qualification, without the careful hedging he applied to most statements about things that mattered to him. Those 3 words had a weight that the kitchen held for a while after Samuel left. The following week brought 2 things: the first real snowfall of the season and the arrival of a rumor. The rumor came through Martha Hale, which meant it had been shaped and polished before release, with the specific craft of a woman who understood that the most effective stories are the ones that can't be easily contradicted because they're built on just enough truth to be plausible. What Martha said in the dry goods store to Helen Garrett, in the presence of 4 other women who would each carry it in slightly different directions, was this: that Caleb Morgan had taken that poor auction woman, not because he wanted a wife, but because he felt guilty after 5 years of neglecting the ranch his late wife had loved, and that the woman was essentially unpaid labor dressed up as a marriage, and that anyone who thought otherwise hadn't seen the way Caleb Morgan looked at her, which was nothing like the way a husband looks at a wife he chose. Helen Garrett told Clara on Friday when Clara came in to pick up the thread order. She told her because she was a woman who had assessed Clara in the dry goods store 7 weeks ago and made a determination and because she believed that a woman deserved to know what was being said about her, rather than find out indirectly from the shape of other people's behavior. Clara listened to the full account without interrupting. When Helen finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "What will you do?" "Nothing," Clara said. Helen looked at her. "What other people say about my marriage isn't something I can control," Clara said. "What happens inside it is." She picked up her thread. "Martha Hale needs something to talk about. I'd rather she use me for it than someone who can't handle it." She paid for the thread and left. She did not tell Caleb what she'd heard. She told herself this was because it was not actionable information and would only create friction with Hale that wasn't useful. That was true enough as far as it went. The fuller truth, which she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge, was that she was not yet sure how she would feel hearing him respond to it, and she needed to be sure before she tested it. But small towns do not traffic in secrets, and the rumor reached Caleb through a different route through Tom Briggs at the feed store, who was Samuel Briggs's nephew and considered himself a friend of Caleb's in the uncomplicated way of men who work near each other and share occasional meals, and who told him because he thought he should know, and because Tom Briggs, unlike his uncle, actually did know when to mind his own business, and this was not one of those times. Caleb came home on a Friday evening with a particular quality of quietness that Clara had learned over 10 weeks to read. It was not his ordinary quietness, which was a settled, self-contained thing. This was the quietness of a man who is managing something. She put his plate in front of him. He sat. He ate half of what was on his plate and set his fork down. "Hale's wife," he said. Clara looked at him. "You heard," he said. "Helen told me." "A beat when?" he asked. "Friday." "That was today." "Yes. You've been here the last 4 hours and you didn't tell me." She looked at him steadily. "I was deciding how." He was quiet. He had the look of a man who wants to be angry and is finding it difficult to locate the right target. "And what did you decide?" "That I was waiting to see if you heard it first," she said. "And what you did with it, that landed." She watched it land. "What do you think I'm going to do with it?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's why I waited." He pushed back from the table, stood, went to the window, not to look at anything, she understood, but because he needed space to move in while he figured out what he was going to say. "It's not true," he said. "I know, that's not why." He stopped. The sentence had started somewhere and arrived somewhere he hadn't planned on. He tried again. "I don't want you thinking it's true." "I don't think it's true, Caleb." "Then why didn't you?" He turned. "Why didn't you say something when you heard it? If you didn't believe it, you could have just told me and we could have." "Because," she said, patient and direct in equal measure, "it was the first time someone put that question into a sentence, and I wanted to sit with it for a while before I handed it to you." She paused. "I wanted to know how I felt about it, before I had to think about how you felt about it." He looked at her. "How did you feel about it?" he asked, and the question was quieter than the ones before it. She met his gaze. "I felt like someone had taken something that was mine and made it ugly to look at. And I felt angry, and then I felt clear." She kept her eyes on his face. "I've been treated as less than what I am my entire life. Martha Hale, saying it from a dry goods store, doesn't change what's true. What's true is what happens in this house." The room was very still. Caleb looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was doing several things at once, all of them complicated, all of them honest. "What happens in this house?" he said slowly, as if testing the weight of the phrase. "Yes, and what do you think that is?" It was the most direct question he had ever asked her. She felt it land with the clarity of something that has been building toward this for 10 weeks and has finally arrived. Clara stood up from the table. She moved to the kitchen counter, not to do anything, but to have something between her hands and the conversation that needed doing, and she said, "I think two people who didn't expect anything from each other have found something they didn't plan on. I think you're a better man than you've been giving yourself credit for. And I think—" She stopped, started again. I think you're afraid that believing that will cost you something. Caleb said nothing. It won't, she said. That's what I want you to understand. Choosing to be here, choosing to be present, that's not what cost you everything before. You know that. You've known it for a while. You're just not ready to say it yet. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture to it. Caleb stood at the window of his own kitchen, in his own house, on his own land, looking at a woman who had looked straight at the center of him and said what she saw there without flinching. And he felt the wall he had spent 5 years building do something it had never done before. It did not fall, it was not that simple or that sudden. But it shifted, like a stone that has been pushed far enough that you can feel it beginning to move. Clara, he said. You don't have to say anything, she said. Not tonight, he looked at her. But thank you, she added quietly. For being angry about what she said, that meant something. He picked up his fork, sat back down, finished what was on his plate. They didn't speak again for the rest of the evening. But when Clara went upstairs, and Caleb sat at the table alone for the last time that night, he sat there for a long time in the quiet of a house that was no longer just walls and a roof, and the ghost of someone who was gone. It was becoming, undeniably and against every decision he had made, something else. 2 days after that conversation, Victor Hale came back. This time he did not come alone. He brought with him a man named Davis, who was his ranch foreman, and who served in that role the function that large, quiet, unhurried men serve for men like Victor physical presence as social argument. He also brought a folded document which he placed on the fence post between himself and Caleb with the measured care of a man making a move he has planned thoroughly. Survey says, Victor began, with the air of someone who has been waiting to use those words, that your east fence line is 4 feet over onto my land. Caleb looked at the document without touching it. Your survey. A legitimate survey, conducted by a licensed assessor. When last month, and you're telling me now. I'm telling you at what I consider a reasonable time, giving you notice before I take the matter to the land office. Victor's tone was the kind of pleasant that is entirely constructed. Of course, there's a simple solution. The fence comes down, comes back 4 feet, and we settle this without involving the county. Caleb picked up the document, read it, folded it, placed it back on the fence post. I'll have my own assessment done, he said, and I'll review the original land grant. Which I have. That's your right, Victor said. Of course. I'd simply say that this kind of dispute can get expensive. Legal fees. Time. If you're stretched, and I imagine with recent changes to your household, things are stretched, it might be worth considering a straightforward arrangement. He paused. I've made offers before, they stand, there it was. Under the survey, under the fence line argument, under every visit and every comment, the same thing that had always been there. Caleb's land, Victor's interest in it. And now a new angle, the implication that a man who had taken on a wife with nothing was a man who could be pressured. Victor, Caleb said. He said it. The way you say a word when you want the person to understand it is the last one before the conversation is over. Get off my fence line. Victor looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes, calculation running its quick course. Think about it, Morgan, he said. The offer doesn't stay open indefinitely. He and Davis rode off. Caleb stood at the fence line for a while after they were gone. Then he went in and found Clara and told her everything. All of it, the survey, the offer, the history of offers going back 2 years. He told her with the unadorned directness of a man who has decided that this particular person is owed the unedited version. When he finished, she said, Do you have the original land grant? Yes, and a lawyer in town, Gerald Marsh. He's good. Then you need to see Gerald Marsh tomorrow, and you need to do your own survey, and you need to make sure that everything you own is documented so completely that there is no angle Hale can approach from. She said it briskly, without drama. He's not doing this because he thinks you're weak. He's doing this because you have something he wants, and he's looking for leverage. I know, the woman from the auction, she said. That's the leverage. He thinks taking a wife with nothing means you're overextended. He thinks you made a sentimental choice, and now you're exposed." Caleb looked at her. "Did you make a sentimental choice?" she asked. "I made a choice," he said. "What to call it, I'll leave to other people." Something flashed in her eyes that she did not entirely contain. "Don't let him use me as a reason to doubt that choice." "I don't, then act like it." He rode into town the next morning and sat with Gerald Marsh for 2 hours. He commissioned a survey from an independent assessor out of Cheyenne, not a local man, not anyone connected to the Hale orbit. He pulled the original land grant from the tin box under his bed, where it had lived for years, and he read every line of it. He documented everything. When he came home and told Clara what had been done, she nodded once with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen and is relieved that it has. "Good," she said. "That was all, but it was enough." The survey came back 3 weeks later. The fence was on his land. Not by 4 feet inside Hale's territory, by 6 feet inside his own. Victor Hale had commissioned a deliberately incorrect survey and presented it as fact banking on Caleb not having the resources or the will to challenge it. He had miscalculated on both counts. Caleb rode to the land office himself, filed the corrected documentation, sent a copy to Gerald Marsh and a copy to the county sheriff, whose name was Arden Cole, and who had no love for Victor Hale for reasons that predated this dispute by several years. He did not ride to Hale's ranch. He did not have a confrontation. He simply made everything a matter of public record and let the record speak. 3 days after that, Gerald Marsh told him that Hale had dropped the matter. Caleb came home and said, "It's done." Clara looked up from the garden, where she was covering the beds for winter. "The fence is on your land," she asked, 6 feet in my favor." "Of course it is." She turned back to the garden. "Victor Hale is a man who confuses having power with being right. It's a common mistake." Caleb crouched down to help her with the covering. She handed him the end of a section, without being asked. They worked side by side in the growing dark. After a while he said, "You knew he was lying." "About the survey, I suspected. You were certain." She glanced at him, sideways. A man who makes his opening move in a dispute by bringing his large foreman as a visual aid is not a man who is confident in the strength of his documentation. Caleb made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she had heard from him. It was brief and quiet and not fully formed, but it was there. She felt it land somewhere warm in her chest, and ignored that completely. The night the rumor came to its full consequence was the night of the Morrison gathering. Ruth Morrison hosted it every year, an informal supper that functioned as the social accounting of the valley, where people assessed the year's events and each other's standing with equal thoroughness. Caleb had not attended in 3 years. He went this year because Clara asked him to, which surprised him, and she asked him because she had decided quietly, with the strategic clarity of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, that a public appearance was more effective than a private correction. She wore the better dress. She wore her hair differently than she wore it at the ranch, more deliberately arranged, though not elaborate. She carried herself the way she always carried herself, when she had decided something was going to happen in a specific way, which was with a composure so complete it read, to anyone watching, as absolute certainty. The room absorbed them when they arrived. Caleb felt the shift in attention, the slight recalibration of 30 people deciding how to interpret what they were seeing, and stayed close to Clara's left side, not as a display, but because he had found, without planning it, that he preferred the proximity. Martha Hale was there. She approached within the first 15 minutes, which Clara had also anticipated. "Clara," she said, with the warmth of a woman who has said unkind things and has now arranged her face into something that implies she hasn't. "It's so good to see you out, Martha," Clara said pleasantly. "How are you?" "Wonderful. Victor and I were just saying how nice it is to see Caleb rejoining the community." She glanced at Caleb with the particular expression of a woman delivering a subtext she believes is invisible. "It's been so long, he's been busy," Clara said. "The ranch has been doing very well." She said it without inflection, without triumph, simply as a statement of fact. The south pasture fence is repaired. The kitchen garden produced better than expected. The cattle numbers are up from last year. She paused, as if adding a detail she had nearly forgotten. And we just resolved the land survey issue in our favor. Completely documented with the county. The silence that followed lasted approximately 2 seconds. Martha Hale's smile did not waver, but something behind it recalculated. "How wonderful," she said. "It is," Clara agreed. "Will you excuse us? I promised Helen Garrett I'd find her before supper." She moved away without hurry, with Caleb at her side. When they were out of earshot, Caleb said quietly, "You planned that." "I prepared for it," she said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Planning implies certainty. Preparing implies you're ready for whatever actually happens." She found Helen Garrett near the table and directed them toward her. "She'll tell half the room before dessert. The half she didn't tell will hear it from someone else by the end of the week. That's more efficient than a direct correction." Caleb looked at the side of her face. "How long have you been thinking this way?" Since approximately the age of 12, she said. "When you have no power, you learn to use information instead." He was quiet for a moment. "You had no power," he said. "For a long time, and now?" She glanced at him, and what was in her eyes was complicated, honest, and layered, and not entirely armored in the way it usually was. "Getting there," she said. They stayed for supper. They talked to neighbors. Caleb spoke to men he hadn't spoken to in years, and the conversations were easier than he expected, because Clara had a quality he was still cataloging. She created ease around herself, without appearing to try. The way a fire creates warmth without working at it. On the way home in the wagon, the night was cold and clear, and the stars over Wyoming were the kind that appear only when the air is dry enough to carry them all. Clara was not asleep this time. She was looking up. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right." "The fire. When you were 19, he kept his eyes on the horses. You said the children got out. Do you know what happened to them?" A pause. "Yes," she said. "The eldest is 17 now. His name is James. He writes to me at Christmas." She was quiet for a moment. "He's the reason I don't." She stopped, started again more carefully. "He's the reason that when people use the scar as a reason to pass me by, I can look at them and feel sorry for them instead of ashamed. Because James is alive, and alive is the whole argument." Caleb said nothing for a moment. The wagon moved through the dark. "Does he know what it cost you?" "He knows enough." She pulled her coat closer. "He said in his last letter that he wants to be a doctor. He said he wants to help people the way I helped him." Her voice was very even. "Controlled in the way of something that is capable of not being controlled and has chosen otherwise. That's a good enough reason." "For what?" "For everything," she said simply. "For all of it." The horses moved steadily. The cold pressed down. Caleb held the reins and thought about a 19-year-old girl running into a burning building and coming out with a scar and a reason, and holding that reason for 8 years through everything the world had found to throw at her. And he felt something that had been shifting for weeks complete its movement. Not fall, not break open, simply arrive. He looked straight ahead at the dark road. "Clara," he said. "Yes." He opened his mouth, then he closed it. Because he had found, in the particular way of a man who has spent 5 years saying nothing, because there was no one he wanted to say anything to, that the words were there clear and complete, and he was not yet certain he deserved to say them, and he needed to be certain before he did. "Nothing," he said. "Not yet." She turned her head and looked at him in the dark, with the patience of a woman who has learned that not yet is not the same as never, and has made her peace with the difference. "All right," she said. The ranch came into view. Ahead of them, lamp burning in the window, the way they had taken to leaving it when they went out together, so the house wouldn't be dark when they came back to it. Caleb looked at that lamp, he thought. Someone is always coming home to this house now. He thought, that is because of her. He thought, not yet is running out of time. Not yet ran out of time on a Thursday. It was not a dramatic Thursday. It did not announce itself as significant. The morning had been ordinary coffee made correctly, work assigned and begun, the ranch moving through its daily rhythms with the efficiency that 3 months of 2 people working toward the same purpose had produced. The cattle were settled, the winter feed was stored. The garden beds were covered and waiting. By every measurable standard, it was a Thursday with no particular claim on anyone's attention. And then, at 10:30 in the morning, Caleb came in from the north pasture and found Clara sitting at the kitchen table, with a letter in her hands. And the expression on her face was the one he had not seen since the auction platform, that absolute stillness, that was not peace but its opposite. A woman holding herself motionless, because she was not certain what she would do if she moved. He stopped in the doorway. What happened? She looked up. She had been so focused on whatever the letter contained that she had not heard him come in, which itself told him something. Because Clara heard everything. "It's from the family in Cheyenne," she said. "The Hendersons. The ones I worked for before the auction." She set the letter on the table, with a deliberateness that suggested she needed to not be holding it anymore. "They want me back." Caleb came fully inside. He did not sit down. "What does that mean?" "It means their current woman left, and they want to know if I'm available." She said it flatly. "They've offered wages, good wages actually, more than I made before." "You're not available," Caleb said. She looked at him directly. "That's not the part I'm sitting with." He waited. "The part I'm sitting with," she said, "is that 3 months ago, this letter would have been the best thing I'd heard in a year. Wages, a known situation, people who knew my work and valued it." She folded the letter along its original crease. "And now I'm sitting here, and I feel," she stopped. Looked at the table. "I feel nothing about it, except that I don't want to go." The kitchen was very quiet. "Then don't go," Caleb said. "It's not that simple. Explain to me why it isn't." She looked up at him with the expression of a woman choosing her words, with the precision of someone who has learned that imprecise words create problems that outlast the conversation. "Because I walked into this house with nothing," she said. "A bag and 2 dresses and no expectations. And I told myself I would not want more than what was agreed to. And I told myself that every week for 3 months." She paused. "And I've been lying to myself, and I need you to know that. Because this letter made it impossible to keep pretending otherwise." Caleb looked at her. She looked back. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else to go. Because I want to be here. In this house. With," she stopped at the edge of the sentence. "I want to be here. And I need you to tell me whether that's something you want, or something you're willing to tolerate, because those are very different things, and I'm done being tolerated." He moved to the table. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and looked at her with the full, undivided attention of a man who has been rehearsing something in his head for 3 weeks, and has just been given the moment he's been waiting for. "Clara," he said, "don't say it if you don't mean it," she said immediately. "Don't say something kind because I'm upset. I have had enough of kind things that don't mean anything." "I'm going to say it because I mean it," he said. "And then you're going to let me finish before you argue with me." She pressed her mouth together, nodded once. "I have spent 5 years deciding that what I lost was the last of what I was capable of," he said. "I made that decision, and I built everything else around it. This ranch, this life, the way I moved through every day. I decided I was done, and I was thorough about it." He held her gaze. "And then you were standing on a platform in Red Creek, with your hands shaking and your chin level, and I said something I hadn't planned, and I have been trying to understand why ever since." Clara was very still. "I understand it now," he said. "I said it because somewhere underneath everything I'd decided, something recognized something. Something that had been gone long enough that I'd stopped believing it could come back." He paused. "I am not the man I was before I lost her. I know that. I'm not asking you to love someone who doesn't exist anymore. I'm asking you." He stopped, tried again. "I'm telling you that I want you here. Not because it's practical, not because the ranch runs better, not because you make the coffee correctly." He said that last part with the slight roughness of a man who is using humor as a handhold, Because the rest of it is very steep. Because this house is different when you're in it. I am different when you're in it. And if you leave, it won't go back to what it was. It'll just be worse. She looked at him for a long time. That's not a love declaration, she said carefully. That's a man describing what he doesn't want to lose. Yes, he said. That's where I am. I'm telling you that honestly because you asked me to be honest. I'm not. He pushed a hand through his hair with the gesture of a man, unfamiliar with the specific kind of frustration that comes from feeling something you can't yet fully name. I'm not there yet with the words, but I'm asking you to stay while I get there. That's what I'm asking. Clara looked at the letter on the table. Then at him. You're asking me to wait, she said. I'm asking you to stay, he said. There's a difference. Something moved through her expression, quiet, complex, recognizing. You've been paying attention, she said. I learned from someone who knows the difference between things that sound similar. Clara picked up the letter, folded it twice, set it aside. I'll write back to the Hendersons tomorrow, she said. What will you say? That I appreciate the offer. She stood, moved to the stove, began the midday preparations with the steady economy of motion that he had long since stopped seeing as competence and started seeing as simply the way she moved through the world. And that I'm not available. Caleb sat at the table and felt something unclench in his chest that he had not realized was clenched. Clara, he said. Don't, she said without turning around. Not right now. Let it be enough for today. He let it be enough. The storm came on a Saturday in early December, and it came with the indifference of weather systems that have no interest in human timing or circumstance. It arrived before dawn as wind, and by 9 in the morning it was wind plus ice, plus the kind of driving horizontal snow that Wyoming produces when it wants to remind people who actually lives here and who is visiting. Caleb was up and out before the worst of it hit, because a man who has run cattle in Wyoming for 10 years recognizes the sound of serious weather in the way it moves the horses the night before, and he had been awake since 3 making preparations. By the time the full force arrived, he had the cattle pushed into the north shelter, the horses secured, the water lines checked, and had come back to the house to get Clara. He found her already dressed, already moving, already filling a bucket with feed for the chickens before he'd said a word. Tell me what needs doing, she said. He told her. They worked through the storm for 6 hours. Together and separately, depending on what the work required, sometimes side by side, sometimes at opposite ends of the property, dealing with separate crises, meeting back at the house to report and redirect and go out again. At one point, the wind took a section of the henhouse roof, which was a disaster that required both of them and significant improvisation with rope and a spare timber and language on Caleb's part that he would later consider apologizing for and then decide Clara had heard worse. She did not appear bothered. By mid-afternoon, the worst of it had passed. They came in together, both of them soaked through and cold in the specific way that cold gets into your bones during that kind of work. And Clara went directly to the stove, and Caleb went directly to the fire. And they both moved with the wordless coordination of people who have spent enough time managing emergencies together that the protocols are established without discussion. Clara made soup. She made it from what was available, which was not much. But she made it the way she made everything, with the focused competence of a woman who has worked with limited materials her whole life and has mastered the art of making them sufficient. Caleb ate 2 bowls. Afterward, they sat near the fire, both of them warming by degrees, and Clara looked at her hands, the scarred one, and the one without, and said, "The henhouse. I'll repair it properly when the weather breaks. The chickens are all right." He paused. One is very indignant about the whole experience. She made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, short and genuine and somewhat surprised at itself, the laugh of a woman who didn't expect to be amused and was. Caleb looked at her. He stored that laugh somewhere. That evening, sitting in the warm kitchen with the storm, reduced to something manageable outside, and soup warm in both of them, Clara said, You didn't send me inside." He looked at her. "During the storm, most men would have told me to stay in. Told me they could handle it and to keep the fire going." She looked at the fire. "You told me where to go and what to do and trusted me to do it. You knew what you were doing," he said. "You didn't know that when the storm started." "I had a reasonable guess." He leaned back in his chair. "And there was too much work for one person." "That's the practical reason," she said. "What's the other one?" He looked at her steadily. "The other one is that you don't want to be managed." "I heard that the first week, and I'm still hearing it." Clara looked at him with an expression that was so open. It was briefly startling, the expression of a woman who has had her barriers met with respect enough times in a row that she has begun to forget to maintain them. "My father," she said then quietly. "He used to keep me inside when anything difficult happened. He thought he was protecting me." She paused. "What it taught me was that he didn't think I was capable." "Were you?" "Always," she said. "I just wasn't given the chance to show it." Caleb said nothing. But his face was doing the thing it had been doing more often lately, a kind of careful attentiveness, like a man reading something important and making sure he gets every word right. The next morning brought the full consequence of the storm. The north pasture fence, the original fence, not the section Caleb had repaired in the fall, but the older section on the property line's far end, had collapsed under the weight of ice accumulation and driven 3 fence posts sideways into the ground. It was not a crisis, exactly, but it was several days of hard work in cold conditions, and Caleb stood looking at it with the expression of a man calculating what he cannot do alone. "I'll need help," he said. Clara, standing beside him, said, "Tom Briggs. He's busy with his own storm damage. Ask him anyway." "I don't." He stopped. She looked at him. "I don't ask for help well," he said. "It came out flat and accurate and undefended. I know that. It's a thing I know about myself." "I know," she said. "Ask him anyway," he asked. Tom Briggs came the next day with his brother and 2 lengths of new wire, and the cheerful willingness of a man who has spent his life in a community of people who understand that ranching in Wyoming is not something you do entirely alone, unless you're determined to do it harder than necessary. They worked for 2 full days. Clara fed all 3 of them and kept the coffee coming, and at one point, when Tom's brother caught his hand on a wire, she dressed the wound with a brisk efficiency that made Tom say afterward to his brother, "That woman knows what she's doing," in a tone of voice that contained considerably more layers than the sentence itself. On the second evening, after the Briggs brothers had gone, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with his hands around a coffee cup and said, without preamble, "I forgot what it felt like." "What did?" Clara asked from across the table. "To let people in." He looked at his cup. "After she died, I pushed everyone out. I told myself it was grief. And it was at first, but then it was just," he stopped. "Found the word. Habit. It became habit. And habits are hard to see clearly because you stop noticing them." "What made you notice?" Clara asked. He looked at her. She understood. Tom Briggs and his brother, he said. Coming out here with their wire and their time, and me not having to manage it alone. And realizing, I had forgotten, genuinely forgotten, that that was something you could have. Clara was quiet. "You've been doing that from the beginning," he said. "Letting people in, the neighbors who needed help. The Morrison gathering, the way you handled Hale through Helen Garrett, and information and patience instead of confrontation." He paused. "You're better at this than I am. I've had more practice," she said. "That's not it. It's not practice. It's the way you see people." He looked at her. "You assume they're worth the effort until they prove otherwise." "I've been doing the opposite." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Your wife," she said carefully. "The way you are after, is that grief, or is that what the grief taught you to believe?" The question hit him somewhere precise. He was quiet for a while. "Both," he said finally. "Probably both." "Then let one of them go," she said. "Keep the grief. Grief is honest. You loved someone, and you lost them, and that's real, and it should stay real. But the thing it taught you, that being open costs more than you can afford, that part is wrong. And you know it's wrong, or you wouldn't have stood up on that platform." Caleb looked at her. Something in his expression cracked just at the edge. Not dramatically, not with tears or theatrics, or any of the outward markers that people expect from a man finally saying a true thing. Just a subtle fracture at the corner of his control, the look of a man who has been holding a position for a very long time, and has just understood it's no longer necessary. "I should have said it before now," he said, on the wagon. "Coming back from Morrison's, I had the words and I stopped. Why? Because I wasn't sure I deserved to say them yet. And now?" He looked at her with the full, unguarded honesty that she had been watching build in him for 3 months through fence lines and surveys and storms and bad coffee and a woman who knew the difference between staying and waiting. "I love you," he said, "not because you're here, not because you run this house and work beside me and see things I can't see. Because of who you are, underneath all of it. Because you ran into a burning building at 19 and came out carrying the reason instead of the wound. Because you stood on that platform without begging for a single thing. Because every time this world has tried to make you into someone smaller, you've refused." He stopped. His voice was steady and absolutely certain. "I love you, Clara. That's where I am. I should have gotten here sooner." Clarissa sat across from him and looked at the man who had said, "I'll take her," into a crowd that was laughing, and had kept his word in every form a word could take for 3 months and 12 days. And she felt something that she had been keeping very carefully wrapped, because wrapping, it was the only way to keep it safe, while she was not yet certain, come entirely unwrapped. "You're not late," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "You're exactly on time." He reached across the table. She put her hand in his, the scarred one, the left one, the one she always had, to consciously decide, not to hide, and he held it without looking at it differently than he looked at anything else, which was how she knew. More than anything he had said, that he meant every word. They sat like that for a while. Outside, what remained of the storm moved on east toward nothing particular, as storms do. Inside, the fire kept its warmth, and the lamp kept its light. And two people who had come to each other with nothing extra, and everything essential, sat at a kitchen table, and held the particular silence of people who have finally said what has been true for some time. But the world does not grant uncomplicated happiness to people who have found it after difficulty. It tends to test them first, to see if what they have found is real or just relief. That test arrived 3 days later in the form of a man Caleb had not seen in 2 years, and had not wanted to see in 2 years, and who arrived at the ranch at 7 in the morning with the specific timing of someone who has planned their entrance to catch people before the day, has organized them. His name was Robert Fenwick. He was 40 years old, and he was Victor Hale's brother-in-law by a first marriage, and his lawyer by current arrangement, and he carried a leather document case that had the look of a prop chosen for the authority it suggested. Caleb met him at the door. "Mr. Morgan," Fenwick said, with the professional pleasantness of a man who does unpleasant things with good manners. "I represent Victor Hale in a matter I believe you'll want to hear." "I doubt that," Caleb said, "but say it anyway." Fenwick opened the document case. "My client has become aware of certain irregularities in the original Morgan land grant. Specifically, the provenance of the northeastern quarter, which your father acquired in 1861 under circumstances my client believes warrant examination." Caleb felt the cold move through him. "That has nothing to do with temperature." "What circumstances?" he said. Fenwick produced a document. "A prior claim, filed in the territorial office in 1859, predating your father's acquisition. My client argues this prior claim was never properly invalidated, which would mean the northeastern quarter is not mine," Caleb said flatly. "Is subject to dispute," Fenwick corrected, with the lawyerly precision of a man who deals in distinctions for a living. Clara had come to the doorway behind Caleb. He heard her there before he saw her, heard the particular way she went still. "That's the quarter with the spring," she said. Fenwick looked at her. "Yes," Caleb said. The spring on the northeastern quarter was the reason the Morgan Ranch worked as a cattle operation in the dry months. It was not supplementary. It was foundational. Without it, the South pasture couldn't support the herd through summer. Without it, the viability of the entire operation shifted entirely. Victor Hale knew exactly what he was doing. Fenwick delivered the rest of his information with professional thoroughness and departed with professional pleasantness, leaving behind a copy of the prior claim document and the knowledge that a formal dispute would be filed at the county land office within 10 days. Caleb stood in the doorway after the man left and said nothing for 30 seconds. Then he said, "If the claim holds, it won't," Clara said. "You don't know that. I know Victor Hale." She moved past him, picked up the document from the table where Fenwick had left the copy, and began reading it with the focused speed of a woman who reads carefully under pressure. "He found this 2 years ago, maybe more. He's been keeping it, waiting for the right moment to use it, and the right moment is now." "The right moment," she said, still reading, "is 3 days after you told me you love me, and I didn't leave." He knows something changed. He's escalating. She set the document down. He thought the survey would be enough. It wasn't. He thought the rumors would be enough. They weren't. Now he's going after the land itself, because he's run out of indirect approaches. Caleb looked at her. "He's afraid," she said. "Men like him always escalate when they're afraid. Because they've built their whole sense of things on the idea that they can acquire whatever they want if they apply enough pressure. When the pressure doesn't work, they panic and apply more." She met his gaze. "We need Gerald Marsh today, and we need someone to go to Cheyenne and look at the original territorial records. That could take weeks. Then it takes weeks. The filing is in 10 days, Clara. Then Gerald Marsh rides to Cheyenne tomorrow." She held his gaze. "This is not over because Victor Hale filed a document. It's over when the truth is on the record. You know the truth. Your father knows the truth. The truth doesn't stop being true because someone contests it." He looked at her. She was standing in the middle of his kitchen, in the house she had walked into with a single bag, holding a document produced by a man who wanted to take the ground out from under both of them, and she was not afraid. She was not fragile. She was not looking at him with the expression of a woman who needs to be reassured. She was looking at him with the expression of a woman who is in this. Fully, completely. Without the exit she had been offered 3 days ago and had declined. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. He went to get his coat and his horse and rode into town to Gerald Marsh before 9 in the morning. Clara stayed at the ranch and wrote 3 letters, one to Gerald with her own summary of the document's weaknesses, as she had read them, one to Samuel Morgan describing the situation in full, and one to a woman she had once worked beside in Cheyenne, who had a sister who worked in the Territorial Records Office, and who Clara had helped enough times in the past to believe the favor would be returned. She sealed all 3 letters, set them ready for Caleb to take when he returned, and then went to the garden, the covered, waiting garden that would come back in spring, and she crouched down beside it in the cold, and she let herself feel, for just a minute, the full weight of what was at stake. Then she stood up, she went back inside, she made the coffee. She put 2 cups on the table. She waited for her husband to come home. Gerald Marsh rode to Cheyenne the next morning, before the sun was fully up. He was 61 years old, and had bad knees, and had not ridden hard in 3 years, and he went anyway. Because he was a man who had practiced law in Red Creek for 30 years, and understood that some cases are not about the law, but about what the law protects. And this was one of them. He sent word back by the afternoon rider that he had arrived and was at the Territorial Records Office and would have an answer within 2 days. Those 2 days were the longest Clara had spent since the auction. She did not show it. She cooked. She worked. She mended the section of henhouse roof that the storm had damaged, not because it couldn't wait, but because her hands needed to be doing something that was not waiting. Caleb worked beside her and around her, and neither of them talked about Hale or Fenwick or the northeastern quarter for most of those 2 days. Not because it wasn't on both their minds, but because some things are better carried in motion than in conversation. On the second evening, Samuel arrived. He had gotten Clara's letter 2 days prior, and had spent those 2 days making quiet inquiries of his own. Which was, what Samuel Morgan did when his family was under threat. He gathered information with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who has learned that the best defense is complete knowledge. He came in, sat down, accepted coffee, and said, "The prior claim is a forgery." The kitchen went completely still. "How do you know?" Caleb said. "Because I was there in 1861 when your grandfather filed the original grant, and I know every man who was involved in that process, and none of them had any knowledge of a prior claim." Samuel wrapped his hands around his cup. "I also know that the man listed as the prior claimant, Thomas Aldridge, died in 1858. 1 year before the claim Victor's people are using was supposedly filed." Clara set her cup down slowly. "A dead man filed a land claim," she said. "According to Victor Hale's document, yes." "That's not an irregularity," Caleb said. "That's fraud." "That's fraud," Samuel confirmed, with the flat satisfaction of a man delivering a word he has been holding for 2 days. "And Gerald will find the same thing in the territorial records, because if Thomas Aldridge is in those records at all, it will be as a deceased party, not as a property claimant." He looked at his son. "Victor didn't think you'd go to Cheyenne. He counted on you being too stretched, too isolated, proud, to ask for help from the county office." "He was wrong about all three," Clara said. Samuel looked at her. "Yes," he said, "he was." Gerald Marsh's letter arrived the following morning, and it confirmed everything Samuel had said, with the additional detail that the document Fenwick had presented bore a notary seal that did not match any registered notary in the territory for the year in question. Someone had created it. The creation had been thorough, but not thorough enough, because the territorial records were comprehensive, and the discrepancies, once someone was looking for them, were not subtle. Caleb read the letter twice, then he handed it to Clara. She read it once, set it on the table, and said, "Take it to Sheriff Cole today." "This afternoon," Caleb said. "This morning," she said. He went this morning. Arden Cole, who was the county sheriff, and who had been waiting for a specific kind of evidence regarding Victor Hale for a period he would describe only as long enough, received the letter and Gerald Marsh's accompanying documentation with the expression of a man whose patience has finally been rewarded. He was not dramatic about it. He simply read everything carefully, asked 3 questions, and said he would be visiting the Hale Ranch before the end of the week. Caleb rode home. He told Clara what Cole had said. Clara sat with it for a moment. "It's not over yet," she said. "Cole visiting doesn't end it." "No," Caleb agreed. "But it changes the shape of it. Victor will try something before Cole gets to him. Men like that always do. When they see the perimeter closing, they make a last move." She was right. The last move came 2 days later, and it did not come from Victor. It came from Martha Hale, which was Victor's preferred method of deployment when he needed something done that couldn't be traced directly to him. Martha arrived at the Morgan Ranch on a Wednesday morning, in her good buggy, alone, with the expression of a woman who has been sent on an errand she has convinced herself is genuinely charitable. Clara answered the door. "I've come to speak with you," Martha said. "Privately, if you don't mind." Clara stepped aside. Let her in, made no offer of coffee, which was itself a message. Martha sat at the kitchen table and placed her hands on it in the manner of someone who has rehearsed this. "I think you should know," she said, with the warmth of manufactured concern, "that what's happening with the land dispute is going to be very difficult for Caleb. Legally, financially, the county process alone," Clara said. "Say what you came to say." Martha's rehearsed warmth recalibrated. "Victor is willing to drop the claim. The fraudulent claim," Clara said. "A beat. The disputed claim," Martha said carefully. "In exchange for an agreement regarding the ranch's eastern water access. A shared arrangement. Very reasonable terms." Clara looked at her steadily. Victor wants Caleb to give him legal access to the spring in exchange for dropping a claim that was built on a forged document. It's a practical solution. It's extortion, Clara said. What you're describing is extortion, using a fraudulent claim as leverage to extract a real concession. She stood. You should go, Martha. Martha stood. The manufactured warmth was entirely gone. What replaced it was something colder and more honest, which was in some ways an improvement. You think you've won something, she said. You and your scarred hand and your nothing dowry and your auction story. You think Caleb Morgan choosing you means something. It means everything, Clara said, to me, and that's enough. He'll grow tired of the project of you, Martha. Clara said it quietly. Not harshly. With the settled calm of a woman who has decided she is done being reduced by this conversation. I spent 27 years letting people like you determine what I was worth. I'm not doing that anymore. Not today. Not in my own house. She opened the door. Go home. Martha Hale left. Clara stood at the closed door for a moment, with her hand still on it, feeling the particular vibration of having said exactly what she meant and meaning every word. Then she went to the stove and made fresh coffee. Caleb had heard. He had been at the back of the house, close enough to hear without intending to, far enough that stopping what he was doing and coming to stand behind her was a choice he made in the last 30 seconds of the conversation. She didn't turn around. You heard, she said, most of it. She won't be back. No, he said, she won't. He came to stand beside her at the stove. Not behind her, beside her. The specific placement of someone who is not trying to shelter, but to stand with. You didn't need me, he said. I don't need you, she said. I want you. That's different. He looked at the side of her face. I know the difference, he said quietly. She glanced at him. And this time, the look between them was not measured or careful or calibrated. It was simply theirs. The look of two people who have been through enough together that they have stopped performing any part of it. She poured 2 cups. They sat down. Sheriff Cole went to the Hale Ranch on a Friday. The precise contents of that conversation were never fully reported, because Arden Cole was a man of few public words. But what became known through the specific channels that small towns used to distribute information was that Victor Hale had been formally advised that the prior claim document was being referred to the Territorial Attorney General's office. 4. Investigation into fraud and forgery, that any further legal action based on that document would compound his exposure significantly, and that Cole himself had a long memory and a patient temperament. Victor Hale filed no further claims. He made no further moves. He did not speak to Caleb Morgan or Clara Morgan for a long time, and when he eventually did, it was with the careful distance of a man who has been shown the edges of his own reach, and taken note. The valley breathed, the Morgan Ranch breathed, and, in the particular quiet that follows a storm that has finally moved on, Caleb and Clara Morgan went back to the work that had been waiting all along. December turned. The coldest weeks arrived with their hard, clear skies and early dark, and the particular beauty of Wyoming winter that was difficult to feel grateful for in the middle of it, and impossible not to feel grateful for in retrospect. They worked close during those weeks the nature of winter. Work on a cattle ranch, making proximity necessary in ways that summer allowed to be optional, and the proximities had stopped being something either of them thought about. It had simply become the shape of days. One evening, close to Christmas, Caleb came in to find Clara at the kitchen table, with a piece of paper and a very particular expression. James's Christmas letter, she said. She held it out. He took it. Read it. The letter was 3 pages, written in the careful hand of a 17-year-old who had been thinking through what he wanted to say, and what he had wanted to say was this, that he was applying to a medical college in the East. That he had told the college about the woman who had pulled him out of a burning building when he was 9 years old. That he had told them she was the reason he wanted to be a doctor. That he hoped she was happy wherever she was, and that she had found people who saw what he had always seen, that she was someone worth finding. Caleb read it through twice, set it on the table. He's going to be a good doctor, he said. Yes, Clara said. He is. He's right about the other thing too. She looked at him. You needed to be found, he said simply. And I'm glad I was the one who did it. Clara looked at him for a long moment. You didn't find me, she said. You just stopped walking past. He thought about that. That counts, he said. Yes, she said. It does. She wrote back to James that night, in the lamp's good light. She told him she was glad. She told him about the ranch, the garden, the spring in the northeast quarter, the way Wyoming looked in winter. She told him she had found her place. She told him to write when he got into the college, because he would. She was certain of that. She did not tell him everything. Some things between a woman and the life she has built are hers to hold. But she told him enough for him to understand that the woman who had carried his reason for 8 years had finally set it down, somewhere, safe enough to rest. Christmas came to the Morgan Ranch with Samuel and with 2 of Tom Briggs's family, and with Helen Garrett, who had no family in the valley and whom Clara had invited, because Clara had been the kind of person who noticed who was alone and did something about it since long before she had anything to offer. It was the first Christmas in 5 years that Caleb's house had more than one person in it. It was noisier than he remembered, more complicated, requiring more logistics and more patience with other people's rhythms than his solitary life had asked of him in a long time. Samuel talked too much and told the same story about the winter of 1871 twice. Tom's nephew broke a cup. Helen Garrett had opinions about the pie that she delivered without being asked. Caleb sat in the middle of all of it and felt something he had forgotten was a feeling. Not happiness exactly, or not only happiness, something more fundamental. The sense of a life populated. The sense of a life populated. The sense of a house that was doing what houses were built to do, hold people who mattered to each other in the same space and let the warmth accumulate. At some point during the afternoon, when the noise had settled and Samuel was dozing by the fire, and the others were in quiet conversation, Caleb found himself in the kitchen alone with Clara, who was doing the thing she always did when guests were present and the food needed tending, which was tending the food quietly, enough that people didn't feel tended to. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. She turned. Something wrong, she said. No, he said. Nothing wrong. She looked at him. I was thinking, he said, about a Thursday in October. I came in from the north pasture, and you were sitting with a letter, and you told me you wanted to stay. She was very still, and I told you I wasn't there yet with the words, he said. And you said, let it be enough for today. I remember, she said quietly. You were patient, he said. You gave me time I probably didn't deserve. You deserved it, she said. I want to say something now. Not because it's Christmas and the circumstance calls for it. Because I've been thinking about it since October, and I want to say it completely. He moved into the kitchen, close enough that this was a private conversation between them, and not a kitchen conversation. I chose you on that platform without knowing why. And I know why now, not because you were there and nobody else chose you. Because you were the person I had been missing, without knowing I was missing anyone. Because every single thing that you are, the way you think, the way you fight, the way you show up for things that ask more than you have, is the reason. He paused. I love you, Clara, completely, not as a beginning or a direction. As the whole thing. As the whole fact of it. Clara looked at him with eyes that were bright in the way of someone who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has just been given permission to put it down. I love you, she said. I have been trying very hard not to say it before you were ready to hear it. I was ready months ago, he said. I was just afraid. I know you were, she said. I was too. Of what? She thought about it honestly. That you'd see the whole of me and find a reason to change your mind. He reached up. His hand was warm on her face, the gesture of a man who has been deliberate about everything and is being deliberate about this. I've seen the whole of you, he said. I'm not changing my mind. She put her hand over his, the scarred one, the left one. He didn't look at it differently than he looked at anything else. From the other room, Samuel said something about pie, and Helen Garrett said something pointed in return, and Tom's nephew laughed. And the sounds of the house doing what it was supposed to do filled the space around them, like water filling what is finally allowed to be full. January arrived, and with it a piece of news that completed what had been building since October. Gerald Marsh sent word that the Territorial Attorney General's investigation had concluded. Thomas Aldridge's name did not appear in any territorial record as a living party after 1857. The notary seal on Hale's document was traced to a notary who had died in 1855, whose seal had been held by Hale's family for purposes that were now the subject of further examination. The prior claim was voided entirely. The northeastern quarter, the spring, the pasture, the ground that made the Morgan Ranch viable, was recorded definitively in Caleb Morgan's name. Victor Hale paid a fine, a significant one. He paid it without public comment, which was the particular silence of a man who has been shown precisely where his reach ends and has accepted the education. Caleb received Gerald's letter on a Wednesday morning and read it at the kitchen table while Clara refilled his coffee. He looked up. "It's done," he said. She read the letter. She set it on the table. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has carried a weight so long that the moment it lifts is almost disorienting. "All of it," she said. "All of it." She put both hands flat on the table, steadied herself, and then she said, with the voice of someone making a statement to herself as much as to anyone else, "Good." That one word contained everything: relief and certainty, and the particular satisfaction of a woman who has stood her ground on every inch of territory that mattered and has been proven right about all of it. Spring came early that year. The garden came back the way Clara had said. It would, the rosemary first, compact and determined, and then the thyme appearing exactly where the original planting had intended it, and then everything else in sequence, following the plan that a woman Caleb had loved, had laid out years before, restored now by a woman he loved in the present, who had understood from the first week what that garden was, and had treated it accordingly. Caleb watched her work in it on the first warm morning of April. He had a cup of coffee. He leaned on the porch rail. The morning was one of those Wyoming mornings that apologizes for winter with the generosity of a landscape that knows how to be beautiful when it decides to try. Clara was on her knees in the dirt, the left hand and the right both working. Her hair loose on one side because she'd come out before finishing the arrangement and hadn't bothered to fix it because there was planting to be done. She looked up. "The beans," she said. "I'm doing the west section today. You said the soil there was good. It is. Come help then. You know the spacing better than I do." He set down his coffee. He went to the garden. He knelt in the dirt beside her, and they worked through the morning, the way they had worked through everything, side by side, each one knowing what the other needed, before it was asked, the silence between them comfortable as furniture. At one point, Clara sat back on her heels and said, without any particular lead-in, "Samuel asked me last week if we were happy." Caleb kept working. "What did you say?" I said yes. She looked at the soil in her hands. "And then he asked if I was surprised by that, and I said." She paused. "I said that I was surprised by how simple it turned out to be. Happiness. I always thought it was something you had to locate. Something distant, that the people who had it were people who'd been given a different set of circumstances." "And now?" he asked. She looked at him. "Now I think it's something you build. Out of whatever you have. Out of whoever shows up and decides to stay." He looked back at her. "You showed up," he said. "You said I'll take her," she said. Into a crowd that was laughing. "Best thing I ever said by accident." She made that sound again, the short, genuine laugh that still caught him when it arrived, and turned back to the beans. They planted through the morning. Around them, the Morgan Ranch did what it had been doing. Since the first morning, Clara walked into it with a single bag and a clear-eyed assessment of what needed to be fixed. It lived. It was inhabited by people who had chosen to be there, which is the only reason any place is ever truly home. Tom Briggs came by in the afternoon with his brother, and they stayed for supper. And Clara fed 4 men with the same focused efficiency with which she did everything. And the conversation at the table was loud, and occasionally overlapping, and Caleb sat in the middle of it with the expression of a man who has remembered, at a cellular level, what it feels like to be fully alive. After Tom and his brother left, Caleb washed the dishes because Clara had cooked, and that was the arrangement they had arrived at without discussing it, because some things between two people find their shape without being designed. Clara sat at the table, with James's latest letter he had gotten into the college, as she had known he, and she read it the second time, with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose faith has been rewarded. He starts in September, she said. Good. Caleb set the last cup on the shelf. Send him something from here when he goes. Something from the ranch. So he knows where you are. She looked up at him. He knows where I am, she said softly. Send him something anyway. She folded the letter. Set it in the small box on the shelf where she kept the things that mattered. Letters and the seed markers from the garden, and one small iron horseshoe that Caleb had found in the barn the first winter and given to her without explanation, which she had understood without needing one. She stood, moved to where he was at the counter. You know what I thought, she said, the morning after you brought me here. When I woke up in that room, what did you think? I thought, I can survive this. She looked at him. That was the best I was hoping for. Survive this. Get through. Keep going. He waited. I want you to know, she said, that I was completely wrong about what was coming. He looked at her with all the directness he had always had. And behind it now fully and without the wall that had lived there for 5 years, everything he had found in the months since a Thursday in October, and a platform in Red Creek, and a single sentence that changed the shape of his life. So was I, he said. He pulled her close. She let herself be pulled, which was its own kind of courage from a woman who had spent a long time not having anywhere safe enough to land. Outside, the Wyoming evening settled over the ranch, the way evening settles over a place where people have finally found their footing. The cattle moved in the north pasture. The garden waited for morning. The lamp in the kitchen window held its light against the coming dark. The woman nobody wanted had become the woman this house could not have been without. The man who had stopped believing in anything worth believing in had found, in the specific and unrepeatable shape of one woman's presence, that the capacity he thought was gone had simply been waiting for the right reason to return. And 2 people who had come to each other with nothing extra and everything essential had built. Out of 3 months, and 12 days, and a storm, and a land dispute, and a forged document, and a garden, and badly made coffee, and a word said into a crowd. Something that neither of them could have imagined on the morning they arrived at it. Not just a marriage, not just a ranch repaired, and a house inhabited. A life, a real one, the kind that holds, and that was enough. That was everything. That was the whole, complete, unassailable truth of what love does when 2 people are finally brave enough to let it.